Hello, my name is Juhi. I wasn't always the woman who drew applause, the one people stood for when my name was called. No, I was once the girl left, sitting in the shadows, smothered by silence, mocked for daring to take up space. At the Ravencore Summit, my sister Vela made sure the room knew where she thought I belonged, somewhere below her heel. She laughed at my dress, not just with her lips, but with her whole presence, turning my choice of fabric into a spectacle. She mocked my degree delivered through a computer screen instead of ivy-covered halls, and she laced her words so sweetly that the insult became entertainment for anyone within earshot. I sat there nameless. No badge on my chest, no title by my chair, no acknowledgement that I had earned a seat at all. I was the afterthought, the stray shadow in a room that worshipped spotlight. What Vela didn't know, what she could never have predicted, was that the man she was desperate to impress, the boss she wanted to tether her star to, was already mine. He walked into that gleaming chamber past the marble and glass that tried too hard to intimidate. He didn't pause at her polished smile. He came straight to me, wrapped his arm around my shoulders, and with a voice that carried across the room said words no badge could outshine beloved wife. But how did we get there? And what else had my family hidden behind their perfect haircuts, their curated laughter, their polished silences that had always left me questioning my worth? The glass doors of Ravencore headquarters had mirrored me as I entered. For a second, I thought I might vanish inside their reflection. The chill on my skin could have come from the brisk air outside or from the way this place breathed sterile and sharp, designed to remind anyone who faltered that they didn't belong. The marble gleamed like it had been polished with the shame of 1,000 outsiders. Even the guards' name badges seemed to sneer. "You don't have one of these, do you?" I tightened my coat, walked forward. My heels clicked against the floor louder than I wanted. I had considered wearing something quieter, something softer. But everything else I owned felt too muted, too apologetic. So I chose the one pair that made noise, not to announce myself to them, but to remind myself I was here. Vela spotted me before I spotted her. She had that way of appearing like a fixture in Power's architecture, perfect posture, perfect timing, perfect control. She was laughing with two men in gray suits, her hand resting lightly on one sleeve as though she had always belonged there. When her gaze slid to me, her smile didn't falter. That was her gift. She could humiliate you without breaking her rhythm. "Well," she said, brushing back her sleek bob as she approached. "Did you just roll off a clearance rack? Or is this part of that whole accessible fashion thing you used to preach in college?" The insult was crafted like jewelry, smooth shining, impossible to ignore. She didn't laugh at her own words. She didn't need to. Her smile was the punchline. I said nothing. I clutched my purse tighter, forced my face into unreadable stillness. I wasn't here for her approval. As I waited by the elevators, one of her colleagues glanced at me, then quickly away. No nod, no greeting, like I wasn't worth the air he'd waste. I was invisible unless Vela decided to drag me into focus. She wasn't done. "You still telling people that online certification counts as a real degree?" She added, her voice airy, casual, like she was asking about brunch. "That's adorable." My stomach nodded, but my lips held their neutral curve. I had not come here to be acknowledged. I had come because it was time to stop disappearing. The elevator dinged. I stepped inside, cutting her off mid-performance. I didn't owe her the satisfaction of watching me flinch. Upstairs, the summit had already begun. A dozen chairs in a semicircle, screens glowing with words too big and too empty. Innovation, compliance, culture, buzzwords for people with six-figure salaries who knew how to say them with a straight face. I sat at the farthest chair, the one with no nameplate. No one offered me a handshake, no one leaned in to ask who I was. I was nothing to them. Then Vela entered with her department, her presence carrying like perfume. Navy silk blouse, pencil skirt, heels that looked sharp enough to carve stone. She smiled strategically, shook hands, addressed every VP by name. When her eyes brushed past me, there wasn't so much as a flicker of acknowledgement. "Let's get started," she said brightly to the room. "Not to me. We've got a full schedule. Let's keep it efficient." The projector light painted the table in harsh white. No one offered me coffee. I hadn't expected any. Halfway through introductions, a junior manager slipped behind me. "Are you with catering?" he whispered, glancing at the notepad in my lap. I turned my head, met his eyes once. "I'm observing." He recoiled as though I'd cracked the mask of the event itself. "Oh, sorry." And he scurried back into the circle as if my presence might contaminate his ambition. Vela never corrected him. She didn't need to. Silence was the tool she wielded best. She was too busy nodding along to someone else's recycled take on digital accountability, her head tilting at all the right moments, her smile placed with surgical precision. I didn't watch her as a sister that morning. I studied her the way a scientist studies a specimen, cataloging every gesture, every laugh, every calculated pause. Vela wasn't a person in that room, not really. She was a brand. She wore power the way others wore cologne, a little too heavy, unmistakably artificial, yet undeniably effective. As the presentations droned on, my mind drifted memory pressing against the walls of the present like a tide trying to break through. I remembered being 16, nervously showing Vela my very first interface project. I had stayed up 3 nights, sketching, coding, tweaking every pixel until my hands ached. Her verdict, cute. She said, her tone smooth and dismissive, but a bit chaotic, like you threw glitter on a calculator. She didn't just critique my design. She dismissed the spark that had kept me awake. Years later, at 24, I submitted an ethics framework to a nonprofit incubator, trembling with hope. When the feedback returned weeks later, I almost dropped the letter. My words, nearly line for line, had been repackaged, attributed to another advisor. I was thanked for my supporting role. The framework carried weight, but my name was missing, like it had been erased before it even had a chance to exist. Now, here I was in a room full of tailored suits where my presence was treated as an error in the guest list. A misprint in an otherwise pristine program. Yet I did not fold into myself. I leaned forward, pen steady in hand, taking notes, absorbing every word, every slip, every recycled phrase. My silence wasn't surrender. It was reconnaissance. Let them think I was invisible. The invisible ones remember everything. By the session's end, assistants handed out glossy folders outlining Ravencore's shiny new compliance direction. My fingers hesitated before touching one. When I finally opened it, the jargon slid easily into my mind. I knew these frameworks better than most of the executives speaking about them. Then, at the last page, I froze. There it was. A diagram. Not just any diagram, but mine drafted half a year ago for a contract that vanished without acknowledgement. I traced the lines with my eyes, recognizing every choice, every structure, every detail. My fingerprints were all over it, though my name had been scraped clean. No credit. No trace. Just theft polished into policy. I didn't speak. Instead, I folded the corner of the page into a sharp crease. A private scar on their pristine copy. As the room emptied, Vela passed behind me, her heels slicing the silence. She didn't stop. "You should network while you're here," she said lightly without looking back. "Smile more. You'll look less misplaced. That one cut deeper than the rest." It wasn't a joke, not even an insult, it was a verdict. I gathered my things slowly, my hands steady, as if they had always known how to withstand blows like this. I hadn't come to make noise. I had come to take note of who spoke, of who silenced, of who stole when they thought I wasn't watching. For a moment, I wondered if silence could scream louder than words. But silence, I was beginning to realize, wasn't always a shield. Sometimes it was the sharp edge of a warning. When the morning session ended, guests filtered toward the rooftop lounge for the networking mixer. I took the stairs not out of weariness, but strategy. Each step gave me time to breathe, to fix my expression back into neutrality. On the rooftop, the air had changed. Conversations sparkled, polished laughter bounced off glass railings, and trays of finger foods floated past on white ceramic. Name badges gleamed like miniature coats of armor, every one of them a tiny proclamation of belonging. Titles came before names, spoken like talismans meant to ward off insignificance. I had no badge. None offered, none requested. I moved without it bare in a room armored to the teeth. A young staffer brushed past me balancing 2 plates of salmon tartlets. His glance skimmed my blouse before he asked casually, "You part of the catering team?" His voice wasn't curious, it was dismissive, automatic. I gave him a small nod. No energy wasted on correction. Moments later, an older man, a manager by the look of him, tilted his head at me. "Whose +1 are you?" he asked. Not cruelly, not mockingly, just with assumption as if my existence required tethering to someone else's invitation. And there it was again, the unspoken rule of the room. To them, I could not simply be. I had to be attached, owned, explained. I crossed the rooftop, slowly weaving between clusters of people who barely noticed I was there, and found a cocktail table no one else wanted. It was wedged awkwardly between 2 oversized planters and sat a little too close to the speakers where the bass thumped just enough to rattle the glassware. Perfect. A table abandoned by choice. I didn't mind. From here, I could see everything, the whole theater of networking unfolding like a script I wasn't invited to read. The air smelled of polished ambition champagne fizzing in tall flutes, conversations about venture rounds, phrases like market resilience and scaling responsibly drifting around like designer cologne sprayed too heavy. It clung uninvited, seeping into your skin whether you wanted it or not. From across the deck, Vela spotted me. Of course she did. She always noticed me not because she cared, but because my presence was an opportunity to perform. She moved the way she always did. Shoulders squared, chin, lifted smile, soft enough to look approachable, but sharp enough to remind you she owned the room. She greeted people like she was both their peer and their prize. Then, as if plucking me from obscurity with one manicured finger, she called out. Her voice had that sing-song lilt she used whenever she wanted to embarrass me and disguise it as affection. "Juhi, come here a sec. I want to introduce you." I didn't rush. I stood slowly, not out of hesitation, but to stretch the moment until it tightened like a wire. By the time I reached her, she was already flanked by 2 HR directors and a visiting consultant from Boston. Their faces tilted toward me, curious but cautious, like I was a footnote in an otherwise polished chapter. "This is my sister Vela," said her smile sugar-sweet, designed to make people lean in. "She's been dabbling in AI, mostly through TikTok tutorials, right?" I held her gaze. She didn't blink, still deciding between YouTube or Udemy as your alma mater. She added laughter bubbling from her like champagne. It was an invitation for the others to join in, and they did. The consultant chuckled awkwardly, trying to soften the edge. "Hey, some of my best devs learned through Reddit threads," he said. It was a lifeline tossed lightly but too thin to hold. I didn't laugh. I nodded politely. Lips pressed, saying nothing. Vela slid her arm around my shoulders, light and condescending the way you might pat a child on the head in front of company. "You're just full of surprises, aren't you?" she said before letting her hand fall quickly as though even pretending closeness might wrinkle her blouse. The group shifted seamlessly back to safer topics and upcoming organizational reshuffling, the usual shuffle of titles and seats. I stepped back without a sound. They didn't notice I had left, but I noticed everything. Every glance, every exchange, every name dropped like breadcrumbs in a trail of power. Back at my forgotten table, I picked up a glass of flat soda. The bubbles were gone, but it gave my hands something to do. I wasn't angry, not exactly. What pressed against my ribs was heavier than anger. It was like being trapped in a room where the air slowly thickens, where pressure builds so quietly, you don't realize you're suffocating until your lungs ache. Across the deck, a senior assistant I'd seen earlier looked at me. Just briefly. Our eyes met, and he gave the faintest nod. A tiny acknowledgement. Recognition without words. He didn't say it out loud. Not yet. But he knew. I stayed long after the others left, after the clinking glasses faded into silence and the rooftop emptied. The conversations had thinned to nothing, leaving only the distant hum of streetcars and the occasional rattle of a bus below. My soda had gone warm, but I held the glass anyway, grounding myself with its weight while my mind wandered somewhere I didn't want to go but couldn't stop returning to. 3 nights before the summit, back at the house where I grew up. The same 2-story home in West Bellevue, every corner still carrying the scent of lemon floor polish and expectation. My mother's text had been precise, almost formal dinner with family before your sister's big weekend. 7:00 p.m. Sharp. I arrived early, 6:45. No one greeted me at the door. When I stepped inside, Vela was already sprawled on the couch barefoot, but commanding like a queen on her velvet throne. She cradled a stemless glass of wine mid-story about a strategy pivot she'd spearheaded last quarter. My father sat across from her, nodding with admiration, the glow of pride obvious in his eyes. And just like that, I was 16 again. Standing in my own house, invisible, watching the performance of perfection swallow the room whole. My mother was in the kitchen, humming a tune I half recognized from childhood, plating shrimp cocktails onto delicate porcelain dishes. The scent of lemon polish clung faintly to the air, mixing with garlic butter and wine. I stood in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, waiting for her to look up, waiting for anyone to notice I'd arrived. She didn't turn, didn't smile, didn't pause. "Don't just stand there, Yui," she said, finally, her back still to me, her voice light as if she were reminding me to pick up socks from the floor. "Grab a plate before it's all gone." The conversation in the living room never skipped a beat. It was like I had stepped into a boardroom already mid-meeting and I didn't have clearance to speak. I sat quietly on the armrest of the couch, careful not to interrupt listening, as if the air itself might crack if I dared to join in. And if the board votes unanimously, I'll probably be moved to head of systems integration by Q2 Vela, said, brushing her hair behind her ear in a way that looked unstudied but wasn't. "It's not official yet, but unofficially it's basically done." My father's smile spread wide, slow, proud, the kind of smile people reserve for trophies, for medals, for proof that they had succeeded as parents. "You've always been the one with vision," he said warmly, and then without looking at me, he added, "Just make sure your sister doesn't make things uncomfortable at your job. Juhi, you hear me?" The fork froze halfway to my mouth. I blinked mid-bite. "Sorry," he added, almost absent-minded. "I just mean, don't go poking around Ravencore. Let Vela shine. No distractions. Be a good guest." The word guest stung. Guest in my own family's story. My mother set a plate in front of me, her movements brisk, tidy. "Sometimes love means letting others take the spotlight," she said softly, as though she was delivering wisdom instead of dismissal. "Just be supportive." I nodded. The kind of nod you give when you know that saying anything else will only make it worse. The kind of nod that tastes like swallowing ash. After dinner, I wandered down the hallway toward the study. The walls were lined with family photos, graduations, birthdays, vacations, weddings. Smiles everywhere, a museum of curated happiness. I stopped in front of a picture from last Thanksgiving. Everyone was there. My father, my mother, my sister, extended family, clustered around a golden turkey and a pumpkin pie. Perfect lighting, perfect spacing. Too perfect. I leaned in closer. Something felt wrong. I wasn't in it. Not hidden in the back. Not caught mid-blink. I was gone. Cropped, erased. The photo had been carefully edited, the frame reshaped to look seamless, as if I had never been standing there at all. Someone had taken the time to cut me out and reprint the memory without me. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't rip it down or throw it across the room. Instead, I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the photo. Not for revenge, but for proof for myself. Sometimes erasure doesn't come from hatred. Sometimes it comes from convenience. Life feels easier for them when you don't exist in the frame. Back on the rooftop, the night had deepened into a soft indigo. The city below flickered to life, street lamps and windows lighting one by one like cautious confessions. I scrolled through my phone until I found the image I'd taken. The Thanksgiving picture. I zoomed in on the space where I should have been, right between my mother and father, just behind the pie. Seamless. Gone. My throat tightened, but the words that slipped out were almost inaudible, carried away by the hum of traffic below. They never saw me. Not really. They only saw what I reminded them of, what they didn't want to explain. The irony struck sharp. While they had been busy cropping me out, busy polishing their frames into perfection, I had been building something no one else could replicate. Ethical frameworks painstakingly crafted, designed to make technology less dangerous, less biased, less of a weapon. Invisible work with visible consequences. And yet here I was. The invisible daughter. The version edited out because the whole picture didn't match the story they preferred. But here's the truth about people like me: just because you cut us out doesn't mean we vanish. We don't disappear. We wait. We remember. We grow sharper in the shadows. I slipped my phone into my pocket, stood, and glanced once more across the empty rooftop. The city stretched out before me, restless, unbothered, alive. And for the first time that night, I felt the quiet thrum of certainty. I had been erased from their frame. But the story was far from over. I was done folding myself into the margins of their picture, done trimming my edges to fit into a frame they had built without me. What they couldn't see back then, what they had trained themselves not to see, they were about to feel in full. The next morning, by the time I stepped back into the main conference hall, the air had shifted. Yesterday's noisy performance had crystallized into something colder, more polished. Name badges glinted beneath the sterile overhead lights like medals pinned to soldiers. Coffee cups sat half full, but barely touched condensation rings staining the tables, while their owners held themselves with rigid precision. It was the kind of room where even posture had been rehearsed in front of a mirror. I chose a seat in the third row, strategic and visible enough not to invite attention, but close enough that I could read every pixel of the screen. The VP of strategy opened with the usual liturgy strings of words stacked like bricks in a hollow tower trust architecture: adaptive alignment, integrity, and motion. Scripted to sound ethical, futuristic, impressive. It landed the way cologne does when it's sprayed too heavy, trying too hard to cover something underneath. I kept my face perfectly still. Then Vela walked on stage. She didn't glance at me. Not even a flicker, as if her eyes had been trained to glide over the space I occupied. She lifted the remote with a practiced hand, and the screen behind her flickered to life. My chest tightened. The presentation was mine. Every bullet point, every diagram, every logic loop and framework on that screen, I recognized all of it. I had mapped those pathways in sleepless nights, coded the back end until my eyes blurred, laid out decision trees so precise they could predict ethical breaches before they happened. I didn't need to read the slides. I could have spoken them from memory in the dark. But there it was, stamped in all caps in the corner like a verdict developed by the Strategy and Risk Intelligence Unit. Lead Vela Brennan. Polite applause rippled through the room. A few nods of approval. One man leaned to his neighbor, whispered something I couldn't catch, but I caught the smirk. My jaw didn't move. My hands didn't twitch. I didn't clap. I had expected this, just not so soon. When the keynote ended, people rose with the stiffness of mannequins, stretching, murmuring about lunch reservations, refilling coffee cups that had gone cold. I stayed seated, my eyes on the screen, even after it went black, until the room thinned. At the water station, I ran into a guy from the tech team, mid-20s, tall fingers fidgeting against his paper cup like they didn't know where to rest. He looked at me uncertain, then leaned slightly closer. "I think your name was in the first draft of that slide deck," he whispered, voice low enough to be swallowed by the hum of the dispenser. "In the appendix, I mean, but it didn't make the final cut." I raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" He nodded quickly. "Yeah, I saw it last week when they were merging files. Looked legit." Something inside me steadied. "Thanks," I said. 2 syllables, more than my sister had ever admitted. Back at my seat, I pulled out my tablet connected to the internal archive. I knew exactly where to go. My login credentials and old testing account Vela probably assumed had expired still opened the door. The folder was there. The version history showed 6 edits. I clicked on the 3rd, and there it was. My name, Juhi R. Mirza, listed neatly under contributors. External AI consultant, framework draft ethics, and compliance module. I took a screenshot. Not because I needed proof I already knew, but because I was tired of living in a world where people pretended memory was malleable. Where silence rewrote history. 30 minutes later, I sent the email. Subject slide 14. Body Vela, the logic sequence shown in slide 14 uses my architecture. I have the original repository with time-stamped commits. Let's handle this cleanly before legal or leadership needs to get involved. You know where to find me. Juhi. No passive-aggressive emoji. No plea for recognition. No softened tone. Just fact. She didn't reply. Not that hour, not the next, but the system told me she had read it. That much at least couldn't be erased. Here's what most people don't understand. I wasn't asking for applause. I wasn't even asking for credit. What I wanted, what I demanded, was for her to stop pretending her empire hadn't been built on the bones of something she quietly stole from me. She once told me, "If they don't ask, don't explain." Well, she was about to learn what it felt like to receive that advice back. Word for word. Because when silence ends, it doesn't always shatter with yelling. Sometimes it arrives quietly with the sharp weight of proof. That afternoon bled into evening under a heavy Seattle gray, the kind of colorless sky that made you wonder if the sun had ever been real or just a rumor. After the summit sessions, I didn't go back to my hotel. I couldn't. The walls there would have felt like a cage holding me too close to my own thoughts. Instead, I drifted into a coffee shop 2 blocks away, a dim corner cafe where the air smelled faintly of roasted beans and rain-soaked coats. I chose the farthest corner away from chatter, away from windows. My Americano went cold between my hands as I stared at the stillness of my inbox. No apology. No denial. Not even a flimsy excuse. Just the quiet system confirmation she had opened the email, she had read every word, and she knew that I knew. That was enough. I didn't expect a reply. Not anymore. I was done waiting for people like Vela to give shape to the truth when it was easier for them to bury it under another champagne toast, another well-timed joke, another round of applause that never belonged to them. At 6:45, I left the cafe and walked through the drizzle to the boutique hotel hosting the executive dinner. Inside the lobby glowed with amber light and hushed conversation. The dining room was staged like theater dim and flattering chandeliers, throwing golden shadows designed to blur wrinkles, fatigue, and insecurity. A place built to flatter egos as much as faces. I arrived early on purpose. I wanted my seat before Vela arrived, before she had the chance to rewrite the narrative with something as small as where I was allowed to sit. The room filled quickly board members, department heads, out-of-town partners with tailored blazers and cologne so strong it felt like another guest. Waitstaff slipped silently between tables with bottles of wine that cost more than a month's rent. The hum of polite networking filled the air. Everyone's laughter tuned to the same professional pitch. Vela entered 10 minutes late. Of course she did. Timing was one of her sharpest tools. 2 junior executives flanked her laughing before she even opened her mouth, their deference like an overture to her performance. She knew how to keep a room tuned to her frequency. She had been practicing for this stage her entire life. Dinner passed in carefully choreographed waves, wine courses, more wine. And then as the final plates were cleared, Vela rose from her chair and tapped her glass with the side of a spoon. The room obeyed instantly, falling into silence with the kind of ease that comes only when someone holds authority, or at least the illusion of it. I just want to take a moment. She began lifting her glass to thank this team. This brilliant, driven, tireless team for making Ravencore what it is. Polite applause murmured around the table. Then she pivoted. Her eyes scanned the room, steady predatory until they found me. And also a personal note of gratitude to family. She paused, savoring it. Some people climb ladders, she said lightly, and others, well, they stumble into the right room at the right time with the right smile. Laughter rippled through the room. Not loud, but sharp enough to sting. I didn't move. Her smile widened, glass tilted subtly in my direction. To my sister Juhi, whose timing and good looks keep surprising us all. This time the laugh was louder, more relaxed. Someone even muttered, "She's got charm, I'll give her that." I didn't raise my glass. I didn't blink. My hands stayed folded in my lap while I stared straight ahead at the untouched dessert in front of me, the spoon catching the chandelier's reflection like a thin blade. There was a time not so long ago when I might have convinced myself she meant well. That this was her broken way of including me, of drawing me into her world, even if she didn't know how. But those days were over. There are only so many times you can dress cruelty up as wit before the costume stops fitting. I pushed back my chair and stood, not because I needed the restroom, but because I could not sit there another second surrounded by people who laughed like they didn't know better or worse like they did and simply didn't care. The room hummed back to life without me, the laughter carrying on seamless as if I had never been there at all. But I was, and they were going to feel it soon enough. On my way back from the coat hallway just outside the dining room, I stopped. A half-closed door breathed out the low murmur of voices. I knew that tone Vela's voice dipped in honey for strangers, but sharp enough to cut if you listen closely. She was speaking with one of the board advisors. Her voice was hushed careful, but the words carried cleanly through the narrow crack. "I don't care if she shows up again," she said, smooth and dismissive. "She doesn't belong here. Not really." My chest tightened. Cassian's just being generous. He'll lose interest soon enough. The advisor chuckled a complicit sound. "You sure Vela's tone sharpened the crisp edge of glass about to shatter? She's clever enough to fool people who aren't looking too closely. But this isn't her world. She'll fade. I could have walked in, could have shoved the door wide open and watched her choke on her performance. But I didn't. I turned. I walked back toward the dining room with each step slow, deliberate, letting the sting settle deep burning into the place it needed to. There's a particular shift that happens when you stop absorbing disrespect and start repurposing it. It's like gathering every splinter shoved into your back and reforging them into a spine of steel. That was happening now. When I slid back into my seat, someone leaned toward me, polite concern painted across their features. "You all right?" "I'm fine," I said softly. "Just thinking." Vela's eyes caught me immediately. She noticed. Her lips curled, subtle and poisonous, as if she could already taste the insult she'd planted, as if she was waiting for it to bloom inside me. She leaned closer, ready to lace her next line with false sweetness. But before she could speak, I turned my head to her. Calm as still water. My voice carried just enough for the three nearest people to hear. "I know what you're doing," I said evenly. "Keep going. The punchline's almost yours to choke on." Her expression faltered. "Just once, just for a flicker." Then she blinked and looked away. Nobody laughed this time. The following morning came early before the sun had even bothered to burn the fog off the Seattle windows. The city felt suspended in gray. I arrived at the Ravencore building at 6:30 a.m., when the air was still thin with silence and the halls not yet caffeinated with ambition. Only a few motion sensor lights flickered on as I walked past. I wasn't interested in another day of polished meetings and performative collaboration. I wanted facts, and I knew exactly where to find them. The access control office was hidden in the East Wing, a quiet place most summit attendees would never even know existed unless their badge failed. The irony wasn't lost on me. That was exactly my situation now. Late last night, my login credentials had been locked out of the server. Not a glitch. A deliberate hand had pushed me out. The help desk assistant, a young woman with sharp eyes and glasses sliding down her nose, looked startled when I explained. I remembered her face vaguely from the security orientation video. Her nameplate read, Zaraya. "Are you—" "Juhi," she asked, blinking at her monitor. "Yes," I said, keeping my tone even steady. "I was a freelance consultant for the ethics compliance module last quarter. Cassian approved the access extension through the summit." She tapped a few keys, her brows knit together. Then she rotated the screen slightly toward me. "That explains it. Your profile was flagged as inactive external contributor last night. Time stamped around 11:42 p.m. I didn't flinch. Didn't need to. I already knew. It was the kind of knowing that comes when you've lived through the same betrayal dressed up in new clothes. "Can you see who made the change?" I asked. Zaraya's lips pressed into a line. She hesitated, then leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Someone from HR. Override access. Not many people have clearance that high." She didn't need to say the name. We both knew. I thanked her, noted the incident in writing, and stepped back into the hallway. The building's silence pressed close as if it too were listening. That's when my phone buzzed. An anonymous email? No subject. Just a single line of text and an attached image. I opened it. A screenshot. A Slack conversation. Her name jumped out at me, bold, undeniable Vela Brennan. Cassian doesn't know she's trying to slide herself into leadership. If I don't block her now, it'll be too late. Beneath it, another line. A response from Leona, strategy lead. The web of silence and performance had just cracked open. You sure she's not just tagging along? The message thread continued sharp and casual all at once. And then Vela again. She's playing innocent, but we both know what she's angling for. I didn't gasp. My chest didn't tighten. My breath didn't stumble in my throat. I just stared at the screen until the letters stopped swimming. This wasn't family bickering anymore. This wasn't about who got the bigger bedroom growing up or whose diploma hung straighter on the living room wall. This was professional interference. Career sabotage. A betrayal with a digital footprint that could not be swept away. She wasn't just worried I might belong here. She was terrified that I already did. I sat down on the bench outside the server room and let the silence stretch around me like a taut string. All this time, she'd been laying her scaffolding. Not just cutting me out of photos, not just silencing me at dinners, not just mocking me into invisibility. She was chiseling me out of systems, out of records, out of history itself. But systems don't lie. Systems keep logs. Systems remember what people try so hard to forget. And I wasn't here to beg for re-entry. I wasn't here to knock politely at a door she had locked. I was here to audit. I inhaled slowly, stood, and walked with deliberate steps to the internal security office tucked away in the East Wing. The woman behind the desk, a middle-aged rep in a navy cardigan hair, pulled back tightly, looked up startled. Sunday mornings rarely brought visitors. I need to file an incident, I said. My voice was steady. Not loud, not shaky. She handed me a clipboard. I filled the pages line by line. The Slack screenshots, the system lockout. The original email threads with Cassian confirming my extended contributor role. I attached metadata printouts, annotated timestamps in the margins. Every line aligned, every detail airtight. I didn't write Vela's name. I didn't have to. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. When I slid the packet across the desk, the woman looked up. Her eyes were slightly wider than before, something unspoken flickering there, a recognition, maybe even sympathy. She nodded once, firmly, silently. That was enough. I turned and walked out my steps, echoing in the empty hall. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even vindication. It was clarity. This was about accuracy, about drawing a line in ink so dark no one could pretend they hadn't seen it. In the elevator lobby, my reflection caught me in the black glass. I wasn't dressed like an executive. No sharp blazer, no couture heels. But I looked like someone who no longer asked for permission to exist. Someone who no longer begged for space. I looked like someone who carried receipts. And I wasn't leaving. Not until they understood I never needed their seat. I was the table. The morning after I submitted the security report felt strange. Not triumphant, not righteous, just still. As if the ground beneath me after years of shaking had finally gone quiet. There was no smile waiting for me in the mirror. No speech rehearsed in my head. Only clarity, clean and cold. By noon, I was standing at the edge of Ravencore's outdoor atrium where the final summit brunch was unfolding like a stage set. White linen tables stretched in neat rows, polished cutlery catching the light chairs filled with people who had mastered the art of looking like they belonged. I hadn't planned to arrive early, but sleep had been a stranger last night, and sitting in my hotel room with nothing but my thoughts felt heavier than walking straight back into the lion's den. Vela was already there, of course. She always was. She stood by the juice bar in a cream dress that whispered elegance, her hair twisted into its usual precise knot earrings, small but sharp. She was laughing a little too loudly at something a mid-level manager said, and they leaned into her as if her laugh itself was a prize. To them, she was the woman who had built this empire with her own hands. She had built something, yes, but not alone. And certainly not honestly. I moved to the far edge of the atrium where the servers were arranging plates, the clatter of cutlery and trays masking the buzz of conversation. I had barely been standing there for a minute when an intern college-aged cheeks flushed from carrying too many trays turned toward me. A silver platter balanced on one hand. He glanced at me quickly and with the blunt innocence of someone too new to know the unspoken rules asked, "Are you with catering? Hey, can you run these to table 5? The intern's voice was casual, automatic, as if the request required no answer. He set 2 trays down in front of me, small breakfast plates half filled with fruit and slices of avocado toast, and before I could respond, he was already gone, swept away in the current of the brunch. I glanced down at the trays. Then, without hesitation, I picked them up. My steps were unhurried, calm, deliberate as I walked straight through the center of the atrium. The clatter of cutlery and the hum of laughter filled the air, but no one paid me any attention. At table 5, no one even looked up when I set the plates down. One man flicked his chin toward a napkin that had fallen onto the floor in unspoken command. I bent, picked it up, and placed it neatly beside his plate. Still not a word spoken. Still no acknowledgement. Then I turned across the room again and slipped into an empty chair tucked in the corner of the atrium. That was when I felt her eyes. Vela had seen the whole thing. She had watched every step I took from the trays in my hands to the napkin at that man's elbow. She wouldn't say a word about it. She didn't need to. The scene was perfect to her, a public assumption, a mislabeling, the kind of accidental insult she savored most. But what she expected to land like humiliation didn't burn. It steadied me. It grounded me. Minutes later, the rhythm of the room shifted. Conversations' thinned clusters dissolved, and people began drifting toward the buffet and coffee bar. I stayed where I was, hands folded, eyes scanning. Observing had become a rhythm of its own, being mistaken for someone lesser, letting it pass, and saving my voice for when it mattered most. That was when a man approached. Late 50s, his linen suit slightly wrinkled his accent. European French, maybe. He studied me for a moment before his mouth curved into a smile. "That's Milan," he said, nodding toward my outfit. "Yes, the 2022 drop, if I'm not mistaken." I met his gaze. "Yes, it is." His expression brightened. I saw the prototype at a closed-door event in Zurich. Cassian's wife wore it with the custom heel. Understated but very recognizable. His eyes flicked over me with precision weighing. "Are you part of the brand advisory team?" Before I could respond, Vela materialized like smoke beside us, her smile too polished to be real. "She's not in fashion," she said lightly with a laugh pitched just above natural. "Just here for moral support." The man's brow furrowed. He looked back at me. "Ah, I assumed otherwise." There's something familiar about her presence. I turned slightly toward him. My voice was steady, unhurried. I worked on the original ethics compliance model for Ravencore. Back-end architecture mostly, but I've stopped apologizing for being in the room. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sharp, precise, like a chord struck cleanly. He extended his hand. "Benoit Moreau, independent investor, Paris and DC. I'd love to hear more about your work." "Off record, of course." I shook his hand. "Happy to." As he walked away, Vela's smile cracked just enough for me to see the jaw tension underneath. She couldn't blink the moment away. "You've got a way of showing up where you don't belong," she said softly. Her voice dipped in poison. "And you've got a habit of confusing being noticed with being relevant," I replied, lifting my glass to my lips. My tone wasn't sharp. It didn't need to be. Calm measured it cut deeper than any raised voice could. A few heads nearby turned. The shift was immediate, undeniable. We were no longer performing for each other. The room was watching. Over the next hour, questions began to drift toward me softly at first, then openly. "Juhi, could you clarify what that architecture supports? You worked directly with Cassian's compliance team, didn't you?" Each time Vela tried to pivot the spotlight back to herself, each time it slipped through her hands, her laughter sounding thinner, her confidence stretched too tight. I never had to raise my voice. I never had to fight for air. The space simply tilted. By the time she made her final attempt to reclaim dominance, her words cracked at the edges. Some people think being present means being essential. She said her smile brittle, her tone sharper than intended, but the room didn't laugh with her this time. I set my coffee cup down with deliberate calm. The sound was soft but final. Some people mistake sitting near power for building it. That silence afterward, it wasn't awkward. It was terminal, like the sharp click of a door locking shut. By late afternoon, the hum of brunch had drained into scattered conversations and tired laughter. People drifted toward elevators, checked out of hotels, folded coats over their arms, murmuring about flights and airport rides. The summit was winding down to its last act, the closing keynote at 6 p.m. Sharp. Business formal. Celebratory. Reflective. Forward-facing. All the words Vela loved best. A stage designed for her brand of performance. I didn't return to my hotel. My body wouldn't let me. Instead, I walked the waterfront. The air was cool, damp, the wind pulling at the fabric of my dress, tugging loose the stiffness in my shoulders. I let it. I needed to feel the world against my skin to remember that this body wasn't just built for standing still in corners or smiling through other people's stories. It was mine. It moved. It resisted. By 5:30, I stepped back inside Ravencourt's main building. The Milan dress, the same one that had confused Vela's guests hours earlier, fit me differently now. Not because my body had changed, but because my spine had. The fabric no longer wore me. I wore it. The glass auditorium at the center of campus was already full, the kind of full that hummed with expectation. Rows of dark velvet seats, an LED backdrop that shifted colors like a living pulse, a branded podium gleaming beneath stage lights, executives, department heads, investors, guests, everyone present waiting to be impressed. In the hush of tailored silence, I slipped into an aisle seat near the center. I wasn't noticed. Not yet. Then Vela walked on stage. She moved like she always did, with the poise of someone who believed she had been born mic'd up. Her voice carried easily. Her smile was sculpted. At Ravencourt, she began, "We believe legacy isn't just built with code. It's built with character, with clarity, with presence." And then the shift. Not in her voice, but in the air itself. A subtle change, like the room remembering how to breathe. The door near the back opened. Footsteps echoed down the aisle. Cassian. He wasn't on the agenda. He didn't wait for applause. He walked straight to the stage, bypassed the prompter, and stood beside Vela. Facing the audience, his presence altered the geometry of the room. "There's one thing I need to add before we close," he said. Vela froze. Her lips parted, but no words came. Legacy Cassian continued, his voice low but clear, as too often credited to the ones holding the mic. "But it is built, truly built, by those who were never asked to stand here." He turned from the audience. To me. "Beloved wife," he said, calm, direct, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "Can you join me?" The silence that fell was heavier than anything I'd ever heard in a boardroom. It wrapped around the space, pressing down on velvet seats, filling the lungs of every executive and advisor present. I rose. Each step toward the stage felt like a page turning in a book that no longer belonged to Vela. Eyes followed me, not her. No one looked at her now. At the stage, Cassian didn't offer his hand. He didn't need to. He gave me something more valuable: space. I didn't thank him. I didn't bow to gratitude. I didn't need to. I stepped up, took the controller, and faced the room. "I didn't come here to defend myself," I said. Voice steady. "I came to clarify something we've all been trained to overlook." I clicked. The first slide appeared behind me. AI Ethics Module Conceptual Draft, Juhi R. Mirza, 2021. Another click. Timestamps, commit histories, server backups, email threads. My name, my work, my proof etched in the language that corporations trusted most. It wasn't just documentation. It was memory that could not be cropped out of the frame. It was presence made undeniable. And this time, the silence that followed didn't belong to Vela. It belonged to me. It was a receipt. Not a piece of paper, but a ledger carved in air, every line a record of the times I'd been told, "You're not ready. Let your sister lead. You should be grateful just to be in the room." I turned to the crowd. Their faces lit by the glow of the slides behind me were a spectrum of recognition, some guarded, some startled, some ashamed. I worked in silence, I said, my voice steady. Not because I lacked one, but because I believed my work would speak for itself. But here's the truth, I paused. Let the quiet hold. Even systems built with integrity need updates. The line landed. A low murmur rippled through the auditorium, moving seat to seat like a current finally breaking surface. Agreement. Uneasy, but real. Vela hadn't moved. She was frozen in her stance, lips, parted eyes flicking from me to Cassian as if searching for a script that no longer existed. The HR director stepped forward, voice quiet but deliberate. We'd like to formally acknowledge that the original framework for our compliance platform was built by Juhi Mirza. That attribution was mistakenly excluded. We apologize. Cassian added without missing a beat, his gaze sweeping the room. She never needed a seat. She wrote the code that protects the table. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply breathed deeper than I had in years and let the oxygen settle in places that had once ached from being hollow. Sometimes, I said finally, my voice gentler, now the ones you dismiss are the same people keeping you from falling apart. The applause came then. Not explosive, not theatrical, but steady, respectful. The kind of applause that doesn't belong to popularity, but to undeniability. I stepped down. Not from power, no. From performance. 2 weeks later, the applause had become a memory. It lingered faintly in me like the echo of a door that had once slammed shut, but now no longer needed to. The new office wasn't glamorous. It was tucked into the east wing of the 5th floor, the innovation floor. No skyline view. No brass nameplate etched in gold. Just frosted glass, clean lines, steady light, and enough space to think without having to explain myself to anyone. That was exactly why I chose it. Because this was the kind of room people forget to fight over, which meant it was mine to build from. I stepped inside alone. No assistant waiting at the door with a folder. No one circling with agendas, questions, or expectations. Just the hum of startup teams, 2 doors down, keyboards, clattering printers, spitting out code into the air like soft machinery. I dropped my bag beside the modest desk and set my laptop down. On the corkboard above it, I pinned the original diagram, the framework Vela had once mocked as naive, but idealistic. The paper was wrinkled at the edges, but I didn't smooth it out. The creases mattered. They were proof it had been carried, doubted folded into bags and pockets, but never discarded. Beside it, I tacked up the email printout. Subject reinstated project architect. Ethics and AI compliance from Ravencore. HR to Juhi Mirza. Date 2 days ago. Body, your former contract role has been formally reinstated as a full-time leadership post effective immediately. No signatures, no fanfare, just confirmation. And that was enough. A light knock tapped against the frame. I turned. A young developer, mid-20s, hovered at the doorway, shifting awkwardly. His stance was cautious, like he'd been sent by someone more senior, but didn't quite know what to expect. This is your space, he asked. It is, I answered. He nodded, glanced around the room. It's kind of small for a lead. I smiled for real this time. Big enough to build something worth keeping. He blinked, then smiled back, tentative, unsure, but not dismissive. Cool. Welcome to the floor. After he left, the room was quiet again. I sat down, opened my laptop, and clicked into my inbox. Not waiting for permission, not waiting for applause. Just ready to begin. No new messages from Cassian. I hadn't expected one. He had already done what mattered most. He stepped back so I could step forward, and he didn't try to narrate my moment for me. He knew when silence was respect. Then my phone buzzed. One voicemail. My father's number. I stared at it. No transcription, just the small orange dot, the timestamp, and the tiny speaker icon waiting for me to press play. I tapped save instead. There are apologies you wait for your whole life. And then there are the ones you eventually outgrow waiting for. Maybe this was finally the right one. Maybe it was another dismissal dressed up as advice. Either way, I wasn't willing to rewind my progress just to hear it. Not now. I turned the phone face down and set it on my desk, like closing a book I no longer needed to reread. 10 minutes later, Cassian appeared in the doorway. No blazer, just a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled up like he'd come straight from work instead of a stage. He held a manila folder in one hand. "The board wants to highlight your contributions at next quarter's investor call," he said, placing it gently on my desk. Formal recognition. Front slide. I looked at the folder, then back at him. "Only if we list the interns too," I said. They caught the logic flaw I missed. They made it safer. Cassian tilted his head, a quiet smile tugging at one side of his mouth. Noted. He didn't press me. Didn't try to convince me, didn't wrap my choice in a speech. He simply left the folder, nodded once, and walked out. That was enough. I leaned back in my chair and turned toward the window. No skyline, no sweeping view of glass towers. Just the edge of a rooftop garden from the neighboring building. A patch of green against the gray. But it was enough. People talk about success as if it's a podium, a spotlight, a finish line with confetti raining down. Something loud. Something staged. But I've learned that real success is quieter. Sometimes it looks like choosing a desk that fits your integrity instead of your ego. Sometimes it's saving a voicemail you may never listen to because you no longer need it to feel whole. Sometimes it's making space for others, for silence, for growth. And sometimes success is accepting that the scar will never vanish, but also realizing it no longer deserves to headline your story. Maybe that's all I ever wanted, to stop folding myself, so others could fit more comfortably, to stop disappearing so their spotlight could shine brighter. To stand exactly as I am and keep standing. And if you're still watching, still listening, still here with me, thank you. If there's one thing I've learned through all this, it's this: silence does not mean surrender. Being overlooked does not mean you are unworthy. And being the quiet one in the room does not mean you have nothing to say. It only means you are waiting for the right moment. For years, I thought if I shrank myself, if I was agreeable enough, small enough, invisible enough, I might finally be accepted. But shrinking never earns you love. It only teaches people how much of you they're allowed to ignore. So to anyone who has ever been pushed aside in their own story, told they were too late, too soft, too invisible, too not enough, I see you. Because I was you. And I want you to remember, you don't need permission to be powerful. You don't need applause to be valuable. And you don't need someone else's seat if you've already built the table. I was you once. I know what it feels like to shrink, to fold yourself smaller so others can stretch out comfortably in spaces you helped create. I know the ache of being told. Wait your turn. Don't make waves. Be grateful you're even in the room. And I want you to remember this. You do not need permission to be powerful. You do not need applause to be valuable. And you certainly don't need to fight for someone else's seat if you've already built the table with your own hands. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to make yourself smaller so others wouldn't feel threatened? Have you reached that breaking point where you finally whispered or shouted enough? Share it in the comments. Your story matters. If this touched something in you, drop a 1 below or tell me where you're watching from. And if it didn't connect, that's okay too. Tell me why. What would your story sound like? Because sometimes what doesn't resonate says just as much as what does. And if this video gave you something, strength, clarity, or even just the reminder that you are not alone, don't forget to subscribe. There are more stories ahead. Some will sound like mine. Some will sound like yours. And maybe one day, one of them will be yours. Because the truth is, the world doesn't just need louder voices, it needs honest ones. And yours is waiting to be heard.